This Chicago Bears defense may start with the defensive line and the guys up front, but so much will end up relying on the back end and how those safeties really keep things protected as that last line of defense.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every day. On the show today, we begin our training camp previews looking at this Bears safety position. You normally start with the quarterback position and go through the whole offense and the defense, but no, we'll flip it around the other way. We'll start at safety. We'll work our way back toward Justin Fields, the man of the offseason. And this safety position, I think, is going to be really critical to the implementation of Matt Eberflus's defense in terms of some of the schematic changes they want to make at safety and really being able to set the foundation for what the other really 9 guys on defense are going to be able to do in front of them and kind of really establish, okay, making sure that you don't have, any sort of major damage that's going to blow through this defense and kind of create some of those gaps that we saw some sneak in occasionally last season. So we'll start with Eddie Jackson and trying to get him back into his form. We'll look at what Jaquan Brisker's role should be at safety, and then some of the other guys on this depth chart as well, competing for what their role is going to look like at Bears training camp. We talked a little bit about Eddie Jackson on the podcast last week about some of the most important Chicago Bears of this upcoming season. And Jackson gets that title in large part because his salary. He's going to be, as of right now, he is the second highest paid Bears player on the roster. And if Robert Quinn ends up being traded, Eddie Jackson will then be the Bears' highest paid player. So there's a certain necessity in getting your money's worth and maybe determining whether or not the Bears want to keep paying him at that rate for Eddie Jackson to get back into more closer to Eddie Jackson levels, because they're paying for, they paid that contract to essentially like 2018, 2019-ish Eddie Jackson, and they haven't really gotten that the last 2 seasons. He hasn't had an interception since 2019. It's not always the best, purest way to measure safeties, but it certainly is notable when you see back-to-back zeros in that department. But like we talked about so often last season, it wasn't just the lack of interceptions, but it was the lack of even pass breakups. I think the official NFL statistic for pass breakups had Eddie Jackson with just 2 on the entire season. 14 games. He had a couple of injuries in there. But when I look back over, I think Pro Football Focus defines their pass breakups slightly differently as like getting fingertips on the ball. They had him with 1 pass breakup in week 14, the only time all season that he actually got his hands on a football. That's not to say that Jackson was therefore completely terrible, but just was not, and the last 2 seasons really, we have not seen Eddie Jackson at that level. We sort of blamed scheme with Chuck Pagano, and then we thought maybe returning to Sean Desai would help get Jackson more in that Fangio style of production, and that didn't quite do it either. So now there's a new running mate in town to maybe be more of that difference maker. Plus, again, another new scheme that will involve, a lot of cover 2 with 2 deep safeties and 5 zone defenders underneath. More of that Lovie Smith style of cover 2. But Matt Eberflus will go to single deep coverages quite a bit, and in a lot of like third down and sort of, third long passing type situations, they'll go man-to-man, maybe bring some blitzes here and there and not be afraid to leave guys one-on-one. But it's going to be Jackson and Brisker as your 2 guys on that back end. They're going to need Eddie Jackson to get back to that form, but they're also just going to need those guys to, at the very least, hold up and not allow big broken plays downfield in coverage. It did feel like last season, and to some extent the season before that, certainly Tashaun Gibson wasn't stellar back there, and there were some times where it felt like the lapses in coverage were maybe a little bit more his direction, but Eddie Jackson had a couple of 40-plus yard receptions allowed this past season as well. He was not immune from that criticism, but the idea is that perhaps Brisker can maybe not right away as a rookie, but eventually sort of develop into something better than late career Tashaun Gibson right now and provide that potential upgrade, maybe not right away in week one, but get something back in that form a little bit. And then hopefully that can give Eddie Jackson maybe a little bit more freedom and an ability to not necessarily freelance, but at least feel like he could be more aggressive going after the ball in the air and maybe attacking receivers at the catch point. And not that he wouldn't trust Tashaun Gibson, but just knowing that a guy like Jaquan Brisker can be there and maybe offer at some point here more of an upgrade, more of a consistent, reliable option there at that second safety, and more of that true like box safety that maybe can leave Eddie Jackson more deep and less underneath in coverage. You don't want to become too predictable and know that, okay, Jackson's always going to be the deep guy if they're going one deep, and Brisker's always going to come underneath. Unless they're too deep, then they'll both be deep, right? You can't make it like that obvious all the time. You have to disguise coverages. You have to rotate coverages. You have to mix up your coverages. And sometimes you're going to need Jackson in man-to-man coverage against a slot receiver. Sometimes you're going to need him deep as a single deep safety. Sometimes you might want to blitz him, right? I mean, you have to do different things with Eddie Jackson, but they need to get Eddie Jackson back in closer to 2018 Eddie Jackson. That was probably better than we can expect Eddie Jackson to consistently do, but 2 pass breakups last season and 0 interceptions in the last 2 seasons is not up to par with the $17 million the team is going to owe him next season. And they seem to be betting on Brisker not only as a long-term solution for the Bears at one safety spot, but then also ideally also then making Eddie Jackson that much better. I do want to be careful not to put too much on Brisker to have to come in and solve everything at safety and be this absolute year one dynamo. So I think it's important to put the appropriate expectations on Brisker and look at kind of what the Bears just need him to do without asking him to do too much. Next on Locked On Bears. I don't think you're going to see Jaquan Brisker in any defensive rookie of the year odds just yet, but if you're looking ahead to this upcoming football season, our friends at betonline.net are going to be your number one source for all of your betting needs and sports information. All of the early odds for football this season, Bears win total, Bears odds to make the playoffs, MVP odds, offensive player of the year, defensive player of the year, coach of the year, plus all the major sports. We're in the thick of baseball season. You've got golf, tennis, soccer. You can even start looking ahead with NBA free agency and what team Kevin Durant is going to end up on and so much more. BetOnline.net is the best spot for your scores, your news, your updates, the easiest way to check in on all the events from across the sporting landscape. BetOnline.net is the place to be. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. The Chicago Bears don't need Jaquan Brisker to come in and be some defensive rookie of the year type turnover machine that takes the NFL by storm and looks like this absolute steal in the middle of the second round. They just need him to be, himself, but just need him to be good enough, right? I think it's a fair model to look at the last Penn State safety the Chicago Bears drafted in terms of Adrian Amos, as far as the type of player they need Jaquan Brisker to be. Adrian Amos has grown and, even like late in his career in Chicago and now in Green Bay, has grown into one of the better safeties in the NFL, just extremely consistent, reliable, beloved, and after a guy who didn't have many turnovers early in his career, he's had 2 picks in each of the last 4 seasons in a row. He's got his hands on a few balls, but really, even back early in Chicago, right? He exceeded expectations for sure as a 5th-round pick. But what we knew Adrian Amos to be in Chicago was like a really solid tackler, I would say borderline lockdown in underneath coverage, right? He's not a guy that's going to get man-to-man and take Julio Jones down the sideline and shut him down. No, that's not Adrian Amos's game. But, if he's in an underneath zone and there's a couple wide receivers that pass through his zone, he's going to sort of lock down one, pass him off at the perfect time to pick up the second one, and really make sure that consistently enough, neither one of those players was open. Or what Amos would be great at is like, if he's covering an underneath defender, he's okay with you catching the ball at the line of scrimmage or 1 or 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And Amos would then not intentionally let you catch it, but he's not going to, he's going to leave a little bit of space there in zone, but then step up and make the tackle for little to no yards after the catch. Like, that was Adrian Amos's specialty. Seemed to be like, it wasn't exactly, I'm going to dive in and break up the pass, or I'm going to be sticky all over you in coverage, but I'm just not going to let you get past me at all. And I'm not going to let you catch it if you're very far downfield, right? If it's just the underneath stuff, step up, make the tackle. And really, like, even if you allow the completion, but it's for 2 yards, that's basically a stop, right? Because if it was a running play for 2 yards, that's a good play by the defense. A passing play that's still a completion for 2 yards is a good play by the defense. And that's what it felt like Adrian Amos's great value was, especially early in his Bears career. He could just, if the ball was completed near him, he would make the play. It wouldn't be for a lot of yards, and it would feel like it wouldn't be a win for the offense, even though it was a completion. And that's the type of thing I'd like to see from Jaquan Brisker this season. I don't need him to make 4 spectacular interceptions. I don't need him to have pick sixes. I don't even need him to have, big forced fumbles or turnovers in necessarily. And it'd be fun to see them. Sure. It would be good for the Bears defense if he was able to do some turnovers in there too. But like, if we're just saying like what they just need is like that consistency of like, don't blow your responsibility, hold that deep half. And if there is a deep completion, say, you're just the back end safety and there's a corner covering the receiver. And for whatever reason, receiver gets open and it's the cornerback who clearly was at fault, in whatever hypothetical here. And the receiver catches the ball 10 yards downfield, you make that tackle every single time, right? Not that he's not allowed to ever miss a tackle, but when you are the safety, the literal safety valve, the back end, the last man, more or less standing between receiver and touchdown or receiver and huge gain, make that tackle every single time. And when there's a receiver running deep, do not bust that coverage a single time. You can miss a tackle in the running game here. You're underneath coverage. Okay, I can live with a missed tackle here or there in situations where it's not as consequential. But in those moments when you either need him to make the tackle or you need him to make sure he's covering this route so receiver doesn't run wide open deep, do that. Just give me that level of consistency this season. And not that Tashaun Gipson wasn't able to at least do a lot of that, but if we can correct some of those mistakes here and there and the little sort of opportunities, it just felt like too often with Gipson last season that there were those type of big plays available here and there for an offense to capitalize. And when the Bears offense wasn't able to consistently enough move the ball and score points, those big plays were magnified even more. That's what I want from Brisker is like, you can make the rookie mistakes, underneath and where you can get away with it, but just don't miss the big ones. That can be enough from my rookie safety, his first season, even as a second round pick. We just can't expect him to be spectacular, over the top, over the moon. But if he can provide just like that level of consistency and limiting damage and making consistent tackles, stepping up and making plays underneath, that should be good enough. It should help Eddie Jackson, allow him to be a little bit more aggressive and going after the ball like we talked about, but then just be limiting the damage, keeping plays in front of you, especially in this sort of more basic cover 2 type of scheme that we're looking at Matt Eberflus implementing in Chicago. Really important, more so that those safeties can just be a real line of defense and that those underneath players can make the tackles short and the safety can be that real true backup plan on that back end. And maybe when you're the second defender in coverage and not the primary defender in coverage, you can then, whether it's Eddie Jackson or Jaquan Brisker, be more aggressive. If you say, okay, the cornerback's covering him and I'm just the deep guy who's also helping cover him, I can go attack that ball because I know at least the corner is also there because I'm not solely one-on-one responsible for this defender. For this receiver. There's another defender there with clear responsibilities on this play. And maybe, just maybe, that's how you can get Eddie Jackson a little closer to that 2018 form, and how Jaquan Brisker can have a big impact as a rookie and then grow even more into his second and third seasons, as he moves along. So I think there's a real path there toward quality safety play in Chicago this season. Not that there was a total lack of it in previous years, but Brisker really seems like he's that right fit for that long haul to be that true option there. The Bears do have some guys to like on the bench, whether there's injuries or whatever may have you at that spot. We've seen some of those fill-ins happen last season and feel some real confidence there. But we'll look at where DeAndre Houston-Carson and Dane Cruikshank and even the rookie fit into this safety competition and backup roles at Bears training camp next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at RockAuto.com. They're an auto parts dealer, an online family business that have been serving customers for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for everybody, and they've got everything you could possibly need for your vehicle. Super deep catalog with parts that I don't fully understand, but I know my mechanic knows what he's doing with those parts, but even easy stuff too, like new tail lamps, headlights, new carpet, oil, the kind of things I can do at home. RockAuto.com has them right for you for your vehicle, and at a price that you can afford, because some of the auto parts stores will have a cheaper price for like the professional mechanics and higher prices for do-it-yourselfers like us, but RockAuto.com prices are the same for everybody, so don't spend up to twice as much for the same part somewhere else. Head on over to RockAuto.com today and see all the parts available for your car or truck. When you check out, write the words "Locked On" in their box that says, "How did you hear about us?" That way they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices. All the parts your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. Top to bottom, safety might be the best position on the Chicago Bears this season, or at least the deepest position on the Chicago Bears this season, given what we saw last year from DeAndre Houston-Carson as a fill-in starter, both with, there was time when Eddie Jackson was out and Tashawn Gibson was out, and that whole secondary was being pieced together with guys off the bench that we weren't expecting to have to play significant roles. And then also Dane Cruikshank now coming over from Tennessee, known as a guy who, he was always sort of that third safety type of guy as well, who was not consistently asked to be the starter other than in injury situations. But he had a reputation in Tennessee of being a guy who supposedly could cover big tight ends one-on-one. That's not to say that Dane Cruikshank is locking down Travis Kelce and George Kittle or Rob Gronkowski or whoever and just Jalen Ramsey, Darrelle Revis style, just shutting them down. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think he was a fan favorite to the point where he gets almost that level of type of reputation. If he was actually that elite at shutting down the NFL's elite tight ends, he would have signed for a lot more money and would be, really handed a starting spot. There's a reason why, yes, the Bears went into the draft with him competing for a starting role, but clearly left the draft with a starting safety that's not Dane Cruikshank and not DeAndre Houston-Carson, because I think that's where we were entering draft weekend. It was like, okay, it's Jackson, and then on paper it was a competition that between Houston-Carson and Cruikshank. You thought, they've both shown borderline starter ability. Maybe you have a training camp competition, and one of the two takes that next step, actually getting a full-time opportunity in the bigger role, because they've always been bench players, or the first guys off the bench, but still bench players pretty much throughout their whole respective careers, Houston-Carson in Chicago, Dane Cruikshank in Tennessee. And that maybe if you gave him a full 16 games worth of starting snaps, that could be that opportunity for them to make more plays and show us more of what they could do and look like potential starting caliber safety. So now you have Jackson and Brisker locked in and two guys on the bench that you wonder if maybe they could be even better than what their opportunities in Chicago this season are specifically going to look at. And so, of course, you will need them to be ready, just in case. I think Houston-Carson ended up starting 3 games last season, and he kind of carved out that role for a little while there. as like the third safety in the dime package. So when the Bears would, and usually they'd take off, a linebacker and have like, three defensive linemen, or sometimes it'd be three defensive linemen, one linebacker, and then six defensive backs, or sometimes it'd be a 2-2, or it should be a 3-2, and then six defensive backs. Houston-Carson would be that sixth guy. Instead of having four corners and two safeties, they do three corners and three safeties, and Carson would play that underneath type safety dime role, and often he would blitz off the edge. I think he got some pressure on the quarterback, but never quite got any sacks last season, but did have a fumble recovery for a touchdown in there, I believe. But regardless, like he found ways to get on the field, which is always encouraging. And you wonder if maybe as Matt Eberflus evaluates the talent that he has, if he might not look to do something similar, given how well DeAndre Houston-Carson has performed in that role. Different scheme, a lot more depth at cornerback now that we'll get to on our next podcast as we kind of go through some of these positions. But still, I think you can feel pretty good about where the depth sits there, and just know that those guys do need to be ready if they do need to step in, and maybe they do get some opportunities as that number 3 safety in those dime packages. And in the meantime, we know them both to be consistent special teams players as well. I mean, I think it makes the 7th round rookie out of Baylor, Elijah Hicks, a fairly long shot to make the 53-man roster. I mean, he would have to really, really shine, but I think they'll keep the 4 safeties and then throw him on the practice squad when it's all said and done. And, given that Cruikshank and Houston-Carson can both be pretty consistent special teams players, you're just essentially replacing Deion Bush with Cruikshank and feeling like maybe that could be an upgrade, given what we've seen from Cruikshank in Tennessee, and given that Deion Bush just never really fully took that next step. Like, it just seemed like every offseason could have been the offseason that he was supposed to compete to start next to Eddie Jackson, and they always opted to replace him. And I think that spoke pretty fully about, and given the lack of desire to bring him back under the new regime, while also really choosing to bring back DeAndre Houston-Carson, kind of speaks to where those two trajectories were going for the Ryan Pace draft picks at safeties that were, again, day 3 guys that turned out to be good special teams players with some spot start ability. Not too bad, all things said and done. So I think we can feel pretty good about the safety position. I think we can also start to feel a bit better about the cornerback position compared to last season. We'll be getting into that on our next podcast as we churn through these Bears training camp previews, all leading up to the big game. I hope you'll keep tuning in and subscribe to the Locked On Bears podcast to keep up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis before things get real again. The big day at the end of this month when training camp players report, pads will be on. We'll get to evaluate all these positions a little bit more closely. I hope you'll keep following on as we get rack up to 5 days a week here as we get to the middle and end of July. Before you know it, we'll have preseason games and a regular season upon us again. The long offseason is starting to wind down to an end. Appreciate all of you who have been following along with Locked On Bears throughout the whole thing, making Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day that we are here for you. And I hope as a result that the Locked On Bears podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.